Hi, welcome back. Thank you for joining me for another episode in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. In today's study, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5 and verses 27 through 30. Earlier in the sermon, Jesus said that unless our righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, we cannot enter into the kingdom of God. And what he says next, he gives us examples about how we can exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. In today's portion that we're going to examine, Jesus warns about the dangers of lust. So let's go ahead and read the text, beginning in Matthew 5 and verse 27. You have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. The Pharisees, as we've already considered, obsessed over the letter of the law. They obsessed over the letter of the law, but ignored and devalued the spirit of the law. A rather noteworthy Pharisee turned believer would later write in Romans chapter 2 that the real Jew was one whose heart had been transformed by love for the Messiah. One of the things that Jesus does consistently throughout all of his teaching is bring together two concepts of equal value. They are method and motive. What we do and why we do what we do. What motivates our actions? The actions themselves are critical. The law, in obeying the law, was critical. But of equal value to obeying the commands of the law were the motivations for doing it. For the Pharisees, their problem is their motivation. The Pharisees are motivated to observe the law as a means for self-preservation and to demonstrate to the world that they're better than everyone else. It's self-righteousness. Jesus is saying that that's all wrong. Another part of the Pharisees' thinking was the fallacy that as long as something was not illegal, then it was permissible. That kind of thinking is with us today. People will often justify their actions or the actions of others by saying, well, what they did or what I did might not be moral. It might not be ethical, but it's not illegal. Jesus exposes the fallacy of that kind of reasoning. So what can we say about lust? What is lust? Why would Jesus condemn it in the fashion that he does here? Lust is often an overlooked problem of the heart, but it is a problem of the heart that needs consideration, mainly because lust is not just one sin among other sins. It's not just another sin that we might put on a list of all different kinds of sins. Lust is the root cause. Lust is the root cause of our idolatry. And as we said in the introduction to this series, Jesus in this sermon is teaching us how we are to give our idols up and return to faithful worship of the Creator through faith in Him. Lust is the root cause of our idolatry, which then is expressed in specific acts of sin. Another misconception about lust is that it is love. Lust is not love. Love does not destroy marriages. Lust does. Love does not wreck homes. Lust does. Lust is something that cannot be satisfied. And that's part of the deceptive nature of lust. Lust cannot bring us fulfillment. It's not going to give us a sense of purpose. It certainly is not going to bring us the kind of blessedness or contentment and peace that Jesus is trying to give us through love. Lust is not just a random passing thought. Lust is not just seeing something that we shouldn't see. We live in a world where lust and sin is all around us. We see things and hear things. We're exposed to things every day that we shouldn't hear and see. But that's just the reality of living in a world of sin. So lust is more than just a passing thought. Lust has to do with focusing on the forbidden. Focusing on the forbidden. A very clear example of this can be noticed in the scandal involving King David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. You recall in that event, one evening he went out on his porch and he's looking and he sees a woman who's bathing in the evening. The woman who was bathing, Bathsheba was her name. What she was actually doing, this ceremonial cleansing that was part of the law, she was doing what the law required of her. David was just there by coincidence and sees this woman bathing. Rather than turn away and go back into his house, he focuses on the woman and then begins planning and plotting how he can commit fornication with the woman. And of course, he does that. And as a result of that, David's life and his kingdom eventually fall apart and are never the same. But the event does highlight that lust is not just seeing something we shouldn't see. Lust is focusing on the forbidden. Lust only results in death. It's not going to bring satisfaction. It's not going to bring blessedness. The only thing that it brings is death. In James chapter 1, in verses 14 and 15, James says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust conceives, it brings sin. And sin, when it is finished, brings death." So what happens when I act on my lust? Well, when I act on my lust, then I sin. And sin, the result or the result of sin is ultimately going to be death. So nothing good comes from lust. Nothing good comes from lust and the sin that it produces. It only leads to death. Jesus in this sermon is trying to bring life. He's trying to bring new and hopeful life for us. He wants us to experience life in this world as God originally envisioned it being experienced. But more than just experiencing a fulfilled life in this world, Jesus is trying to offer us the way that we can experience an eternal life. And lust, if it is not properly dealt with, will get in the way of all of that from happening. Lust is connected to the heart. Jesus connects it to the heart in what he says here in the Sermon on the Mount. Again, the Pharisees justified their attitudes and behaviors purely upon what they did in reference to the law, when in reality, what they were doing with reference to the law was evidence of their corrupt hearts. The irony of the problem with the Pharisees is that the old law actually dealt with the subject of lust. For example, the 9th commandment is a prohibition against covetousness. Covetousness is lust. Covetousness has to do with overwhelming desires for what is forbidden, whether it is, to use language from the 9th commandment, whether it is your neighbor's wife or one of your neighbor's possessions. This overwhelming desire, focusing on the forbidden, is covetousness, and that's prohibited. Another example of the old law or the Old Testament dealing with lust, in Proverbs chapter 6, Solomon identifies lust as being the cause of adultery. That sounds just like what Jesus is dealing with in this part of the Sermon on the Mount. Why do people commit adultery? Because of lust, because of their heart focusing on what is forbidden. Jesus connects everything that we do to our heart, and there are plenty of examples of this noted in his teaching. In Matthew chapter 15, Jesus draws an analogy between the heart, what comes into the heart and what goes out, but compares this analogy between that and food coming into the body. When we eat, our body, it absorbs what is nutritious, and it discards and expels what is not. And in the same way, that's what happens or is to happen in our heart. As I said a moment ago, we live in a world of sin, and we're exposed to all kinds of sin and in things that are enticing to us. Well, what do we do with those things? Do we focus on them? Do we bring them into our heart? Or do we discard them? Well, Jesus wants us to discard things. When we sin, as he describes in Matthew 15, when we're dishonest, when someone commits murder, when someone commits adultery, it's the result of what has been allowed to grow in his heart. So Jesus recognizes until we get our hearts right, our lives are never going to be lives that are reflecting the glory of God. Remember, as Jesus said in the Beatitudes, the blessedness of the kingdom only comes to the pure in heart, those whose hearts are fully open to the love of God. So how can we address lust? Well, a couple of points. First of all, lust has got to be sacrificed. We have to give it up. Jesus describes rather extreme measures to be taken in this part of the sermon. He talks about poking out eyes and cutting off hands. The point being, lust has got to be sacrificed. It has got to be removed from us fully and completely. Secondly, we need to honor our marriage vows. Adultery is something that will destroy a marriage. And if we're going to protect that marriage by guarding our hearts, then it's going to be involving us honoring the vows that we made to our spouse, to forsake all others and to cleave to our spouse. And then lastly, if we're going to address our lust, it's going to have to do with focusing our mind. How we think matters. In Philippians chapter 4, in verse 8, Paul describes, lists a number of things, concepts that we should think on, to set our minds on. In Colossians chapter 3, in the first 5 verses, Paul talks about how we're supposed to focus on heaven, that we're to set our hearts, set our minds on things that are above, not on things of the earth. So we're to set our minds on God. We're to set our minds on Christ and in executing the purposes of his kingdom in this world. We're to give our minds, our lives entirely to fulfilling the purposes of the kingdom in the world. Well, in conclusion, there's a very important point, hopefully, that you begin to see emerging by this point in the sermon. As we've been considering the moral and ethical teachings of Jesus, what begins to emerge is the fact that Jesus holds us accountable not just for what we do, but for what we think. As Solomon said long ago, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And that's as true now as it has ever been. So we need to set our minds right. We need to open our minds and open our hearts to Christ and to the message, the transformative message of this sermon. And I hope that we will seek to do that more and more each day. Well, thank you again for joining me. I hope the study has been helpful and thought-provoking for you. Join me next time as we continue in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. Thank you and have a nice day.